Imagine locking the door behind you on your honeymoon night. The mountains are quiet. The air is cold. The future feels endless. Now imagine this. By Sunday morning, your car is still parked outside. Your luggage is still inside. The bed has been made. But you are gone. No signs of struggle. No bodies. No footprints in the forest. Just an unlocked door in the Smoky Mountains. And a mystery that has remained unsolved for 36 years. This is the disappearance of Thomas Clark and Bobbie Taylor. And what investigators found in the woods makes this case even darker. Stay with me. Because this case deserves to be heard. Before we go any further, if you are new here, welcome to Cold Case YTJ. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring that notification bell. Drop a like on this video if you believe cold cases deserve justice. And leave a comment below telling me, have you ever heard of Thomas and Bobbie? Let's make sure their names are never forgotten. Now let's get into it. To understand what happened, you first have to understand the world Thomas and Bobbie were living in. It was 1990. September. The kind of September that comes to the Smoky Mountains like a slow exhale, the summer heat finally giving way, the leaves on the verge of turning, the air carrying that particular bite that tells you winter is somewhere on the horizon but not here yet. Not quite. Gatlinburg was alive the way it always is in the shoulder season. The hardcore summer tourists had thinned out, but the town had not gone quiet. There were still families driving up from Georgia and the Carolinas, still couples looking for somewhere beautiful to disappear for a weekend. The restaurants were still lit up at night. The mountain roads were still busy. Thomas Clark and Bobbie Taylor had chosen this place on purpose. Bobbie had dreamed of the Smokies since she was a little girl. Her grandmother used to talk about them like they were the edge of the world, the place where the sky came down and touched the earth. Thomas had never been. He wanted to give her that. He had gone ahead and reserved a cabin at Whispering Pines Lodge, a small property set up on a hill just outside the main strip of town, surrounded by pine trees that pressed in close on every side. The lodge had a good reputation. Nothing fancy. Just clean, quiet, well-kept. The kind of place you go when you do not want a hotel but you want to feel held by something solid. There was a fireplace. There was a porch. There were windows that looked out over the tops of the trees all the way to the mountains in the distance. They arrived on a Friday. The owner of the lodge, a woman in her 60s who had been running the property for over 20 years, later told investigators that she remembered them clearly. They were happy, she said. The kind of happy that is almost embarrassing to look at directly, because it is so complete and so obvious. They paid in cash for 5 nights. They carried their bags in themselves, laughing about something she could not hear. They shut the cabin door behind them. That was the last time anyone outside this case can say with certainty that they saw Thomas Clark and Bobbie Taylor alive. The owner saw the cabin lights on that first night. She did not disturb them, honeymooners, she thought, they needed their privacy. On Saturday, she noticed the curtains on the front windows were still drawn. She did not think much of it. On Sunday morning, she walked up to the cabin to leave a small welcome basket she had forgotten to put out when they arrived. A Gatlinburg tradition. Local honey. A hand-drawn map of the hiking trails. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. Nothing. She tried the door. It was unlocked. She pushed it open and called their names into the dim interior. No one answered. She stepped inside. The bed in the main room had been made, but in that way that suggests someone made it quickly, not the way a housekeeper would. There were 2 glasses on the small wooden table beside the window, both empty. There was a woman's red sweater folded over the back of a chair. A man's jacket hung near the door. Their luggage was still there. Their car was still in the gravel lot outside. But Thomas Clark and Bobbie Taylor were gone. The owner stood in that cabin for a long moment. Later, she would say that she felt something she could not explain, not fear exactly, but a wrongness. The kind of feeling you get when you walk into a room and realize the thing that was supposed to be there is missing, and you cannot quite place what it was. She walked back to the main house and called the local sheriff's department. The deputy who responded was experienced. He had handled missing persons calls before, mostly hikers who had pushed too far into the backcountry and gotten turned around. He took the calls seriously, but he also arrived with the working assumption that there was probably a simple explanation. Maybe the couple had gone for an early hike. Maybe they had borrowed a neighbor's car. Maybe there had been a family emergency and they had left in a hurry. But their luggage was there. Their car was there. The red sweater was there. The jacket was there. People who leave in a hurry do not leave their luggage and their car. By Sunday afternoon, the deputy had called in a full report. By Sunday evening, a search team had been assembled. By Monday morning, they were in the woods behind Whispering Pines Lodge with grid maps and red ribbons and dogs trained to follow human scent. They searched for 11 days. They found nothing. Not a footprint. Not a piece of clothing. Not a trace of the two people who had paid cash for 5 nights in that cabin and then ceased to exist. The investigation was formally opened. Detectives from the county sheriff's office took over. They interviewed the lodge owner repeatedly. They interviewed the neighboring cabin guests, a family of 4 who had been staying next door and heard nothing unusual. They interviewed workers at nearby restaurants and shops, showing photographs of Thomas and Bobbie to everyone who would look. A few people thought they recognized the faces. A waitress at a diner on the main strip thought she remembered them coming in for dinner on Friday night. A gas station attendant thought he might have sold a man matching Thomas's description a bottle of water on Saturday morning. But the sightings were vague, disconnected, and none of them could be confirmed. The families arrived in Gatlinburg within 48 hours of the first report. Bobbie's mother and her younger sister flew in from out of state. Thomas's parents drove through the night from their home in East Tennessee, barely stopping. They descended on that small mountain town carrying their terror quietly, the way families do when they are trying to hold themselves together long enough to be useful. They answered every question. They provided photographs, dental records, clothing descriptions. They offered to go on local television and beg for information. They walked the woods themselves, calling out names into the trees until their voices gave out. And they waited. The weeks passed. The investigation produced no concrete leads. Local law enforcement, operating with limited resources and no clear evidence of foul play, began to explore alternative explanations. Had the couple chosen to disappear voluntarily? Were there financial troubles? Marital problems? Were there reasons someone might want to leave their life behind? The families rejected this. Thomas and Bobbie were happy, they insisted. There were no debts that would drive them away. There were no secrets that would explain it. They had just gotten married. They had plans for the future. A house they were saving for. A dog Bobbie had already named. A life that was only just beginning. But law enforcement had seen enough cases to know that people are not always what their families believe them to be. The possibility of a voluntary disappearance stayed on the table. And so, too, did something far darker. The Smoky Mountains, for all their beauty, have their shadows. The backcountry is vast and largely unmapped in its remotest sections. People had disappeared out there before, hikers, campers, people who underestimated the terrain. Some had been found eventually. Some had not. The mountains keep what they take. The search teams went back in. They expanded the grid. They brought in helicopters to scan the canopy. They used cadaver dogs trained to detect the specific chemistry of human remains even under feet of soil and fallen leaves. They found nothing. By the end of October 1990, the official search had been wound down. The case file stayed open, but the active investigation had stalled. The families returned home, hollowed out in a way that would never quite heal. The red ribbons on the trees behind Whispering Pines Lodge fluttered in the mountain wind as autumn turned to winter. The cabin was cleaned, repaired, and rented out again. Life in Gatlinburg moved forward, the way life always moves forward, even when it should not. But for the Clarks and the Taylors, time had stopped. It would stay stopped for a very long time. 2 years is a long time to live inside a question with no answer. By early 1992, both families had learned to carry the weight of not knowing in different ways. Bobbie's mother kept a folder on her kitchen table, newspaper clippings, copies of the official case file, letters she had written to state senators and federal agencies asking for more attention, more resources, more eyes on a disappearance that seemed to be sliding quietly out of the public consciousness. Thomas's parents kept a room in their house exactly as it had been when their son was alive, a habit common to parents of missing children that speaks to the particular agony of an absence with no confirmed ending. Every road trip, every news report about an unidentified body found somewhere in the southeast, every anonymous call from another state, all of it came packaged with the same question they could never escape. Where did they go? In early 1992, both families made a joint decision. Local law enforcement had done what it could. The official investigation was technically still open, but realistically dormant. If they wanted answers, they would have to find someone who could work the case from the outside. They pooled their savings. Not a small thing, these were working families, people who measured their financial lives carefully. But they pooled what they had and hired 2 private investigators. One operated out of Knoxville. The other was based in Chattanooga. 2 professionals, working independently, both tasked with finding what the county had missed. For months, the leads were thin. The investigators interviewed everyone local law enforcement had spoken to, and then they went further, talking to former employees of the lodge, to hikers who had been in the area during that September weekend, to anyone who had ever called in a tip that had gone nowhere. They were methodical. They were thorough. And then March arrived. The Knoxville investigator received a notification that sent his pulse into his throat. A credit card under Thomas Clark's name had been used at a small gas station in northern Alabama. The charge was modest, $24 for fuel, but the implications were enormous. Thomas Clark's credit cards had not been used since the couple's disappearance. Not once in over a year and a half. And now, suddenly, someone was using one. The investigator called the families before he even booked his drive south. He tried to manage expectations. But hope, when it has been starved long enough, does not accept management. Both families felt it surge through them like something electric. Maybe they were alive. Maybe, somehow, something had happened in that cabin that had nothing to do with violence or foul play. Maybe Thomas and Bobbie had made a choice, a strange, devastating, impossible choice, to simply disappear from their old lives. It was not the ending anyone wanted. But it was an ending with a heartbeat. The investigator drove to Alabama the same day. He spoke to the clerk at the gas station, a young man, early 20s, who worked the morning shift. The clerk remembered the transaction. The man who had used the card was in his early 30s, quiet, unremarkable, traveling alone. He had paid for fuel and left without conversation. The investigator asked about the security cameras. The clerk pointed to a camera mounted above the register. It had been broken for months. Of course it had. But before the investigator could fully reckon with that disappointment, Alabama State Police handed him something that scrambled the entire picture. A discarded wallet had been found on the roadside a few miles from that same gas station. It had been lying there long enough that the edges were weather-worn, but the contents were intact. Inside was Thomas Clark's driver's license. His credit cards. And a photograph, removed from its slot and placed loosely in the billfold, of Thomas and Bobbie on their wedding day. The two of them caught mid-laugh, the way people only look when they believe the best is still ahead of them. For a moment, looking at that photograph in an Alabama police evidence bag, the investigator felt the full weight of what had been lost. Then forensics examined the wallet itself. The leather. The stitching. The style and construction. None of it matched the wallet Thomas Clark's family remembered him carrying. It was a different wallet entirely, one that had simply been loaded with his identification. Forensics concluded with reasonable certainty that the wallet had either been planted as a deliberate misdirection, or it was the product of straightforward identity theft, someone who had come across Thomas's documents and was using them without any knowledge of or connection to the disappearance. Whoever had used that credit card was not Thomas Clark. By May, they had their answer on that front too. The man who had used the card was found and arrested. His name was Lyle Benson. A drifter with no fixed address, no known connection to Gatlinburg, no connection to Thomas or Bobbie in any form. He told police he had found the wallet at a highway rest stop near Birmingham. He did not know whose it was. He used it because it worked. Because $24 of someone else's fuel was $24 he did not have to spend. There was no malice in Lyle Benson's version of events. There was barely even awareness. He had stumbled across a dead man's wallet, or a missing man's wallet, and used it without a second thought. The Alabama lead was officially closed. The question of how Thomas Clark's wallet ended up at a rest stop in Birmingham was added to the long list of questions this case could not answer and filed away accordingly. The families absorbed this. They had no choice but to absorb it. They were getting practiced at absorbing things that would have broken most people. Then came the witnesses. In the months that followed, the private investigators fielded a stream of tips from people who claimed to have seen Thomas and Bobbie after the disappearance. Most of these tips followed a familiar pattern, vague, emotionally charged, ultimately impossible to substantiate. But two of them cut deeper than the rest. The first came from a long-haul trucker who contacted the Knoxville investigator directly. He said he had seen a couple matching Thomas and Bobbie's description hitchhiking on a road near Pigeon Forge, just days after they had gone missing from the cabin. He was confident. He was detailed. He said the woman had been wearing a red sweater. A red sweater. That detail had never been released to the press. The only people who knew about the red sweater found on the chair in that cabin were the lodge owner, the responding deputies, the detective who wrote the initial report, and the families. For a brief, electric moment, it seemed like this trucker had genuinely seen them. Then investigators sat down with the timeline. The trucker had his dates wrong. Not slightly wrong. A full week wrong. The sighting he described with such clarity and confidence had occurred, according to his own account, once the dates were pinned down, a full 7 days before Thomas and Bobbie ever checked into Whispering Pines Lodge. Before they had even arrived in Gatlinburg. Whatever woman in a red sweater that trucker had seen on that roadside near Pigeon Forge, it was not Bobbie Taylor. The second tip came from a woman in northern Georgia. She called the tip line and asked to speak with an investigator directly, not a clerk. When she got one, she told him that some time ago she had received a phone call in the middle of the night from a young woman she did not know. The woman on the other end of the line had been crying, barely able to speak. She had said she was trapped in a cabin somewhere and could not leave. She had said her name was Bobbie. Even hardened investigators felt the chill of that one. They pulled the phone company records immediately. They traced the call. It had originated from a number in Florida, not Tennessee. And the date of the call, verified by the phone records, predated the Gatlinburg disappearance by a significant margin. The call had nothing to do with Bobbie Taylor. It was, at best, a cruel coincidence. A stranger's distress call from a year before this case began, attaching itself to a grieving family's worst fears through the terrible randomness of a shared first name. Every lead faded the same way. Bright and urgent at first, then hollow, then gone. Studio microphone, if you are still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who is truly following this shocking story. And while you are down there, subscribe to Cold Case YTJ if you have not already. Every subscriber tells the algorithm this story matters. Let's keep Thomas and Bobbie's case alive together. By late 1993, the story had stopped being front-page news. The television stations in Knoxville no longer sent crews to cover the annual memorials. The regional papers ran shorter and shorter mentions each September, the anniversary of the disappearance shrinking in column inches the way memories shrink when they belong to other people. The case file remained technically open at the county sheriff's office, but open in the way that a wound can technically be open, not actively bleeding, but not healed either. In Gatlinburg itself, something else was happening. The way that small towns sometimes metabolize tragedy they cannot explain, the story of Thomas Clark and Bobbie Taylor was slowly being transformed into something the community could hold without being destroyed by it. People started calling Whispering Pines Lodge the honeymoon cabin. And eventually, quietly, they started calling Thomas and Bobbie the honeymoon ghosts. It is a strange thing to become folklore while the people who love you are still alive and still searching. Bobbie's mother was still updating her folder on the kitchen table. Thomas's father still drove past the county sheriff's office every few weeks to ask if anything had come in. The private investigators had been let go when the families could no longer sustain the cost, but the case had been shared with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Persons, where it sat in a database among thousands of others. But in Gatlinburg, on the hill where the cabin stood, the story had become something quieter and stranger. Guests who booked the lodge in the years after the disappearance began to report things. Small things. A cold draft from a window that was definitely closed. The sound of movement in the room adjacent to theirs when no one was in it. A feeling, hard to articulate, the kind of thing people mention sheepishly, apologetically, of being watched from the edge of the trees. Most of these reports were easy to explain away. Old mountain cabins breathe. Wood contracts in the cold. Animals move through the forests at night in ways that carry sound strangely through the walls. But the stories accumulated, the way stories do, and people began seeking the cabin out specifically because of them. There was something deeply uncomfortable about that. A couple who had vanished, whose families were still suffering, whose case remained unsolved, transformed into an attraction. Into a story people drove up the mountain to experience, to feel something delicious and dark. The families were not consulted about this. They were not amused by it. Bobbie's sister gave a brief interview to a regional magazine sometime around 1994 in which she said something that has stayed with me since I first encountered this case. She said that the hardest part of not having a body, not having an ending, was that the people you lost never quite stopped existing in your imagination. They stayed alive in there, perpetually, at the age they were when you last saw them. And the world outside kept trying to make them into something else. Something symbolic. Something ghostly. Something that belonged to everyone instead of to the people who actually loved them. She said she just wanted her sister back. She said she would spend the rest of her life wanting that. The investigation did not die completely. It breathed. Shallowly, intermittently, but it breathed. In 1995, a new detective was assigned to review the cold case files at the county sheriff's office, a younger man, recently promoted, who had not been part of the original investigation and came to it without the fatigue and frustration that had settled into the officers who had lived through those first fruitless weeks. He requested the complete file and spent several weeks reading it end to end. What he found, or rather, what he noticed that others had perhaps glossed over, was a detail buried in the original search report. One of the cadaver dogs trained specifically to alert on the scent of human remains had shown unusual behavior in a specific section of the forest northeast of the lodge. Not a full alert. Just agitation. A circling. A return to the same area multiple times without locking onto a defined point. In the original report, this behavior had been noted and then set aside. The dog handler at the time had concluded that the dog was reacting to animal remains. Deer were plentiful in that area, and decomposed animal matter could sometimes produce a similar but distinguishable response in even the best-trained dogs. The team had moved on. The new detective was not satisfied with that explanation. He requested that a new search team, with fresh dogs and fresh eyes, be sent into that northeast section of the forest. The request was approved. The search went forward in the spring of 1996, nearly 6 years after Thomas and Bobbie had disappeared. The new dogs showed agitation in the same general area. The team excavated carefully at several points. They found what they were looking for and also what no one wanted to find in equal measure: evidence of disturbed soil, inconsistent with natural erosion or animal activity, in an area about a quarter-mile from the lodge. But the disturbance was old. And the forest had done what forests do, which is reclaim everything. They found no human remains. They found no clothing, no personal effects, no physical evidence linking the disturbed soil to Thomas or Bobbie. What they found instead was the suggestion, nothing more, nothing legally actionable, that something had happened in that part of the forest at some point in the past. The forensic soil analyst brought in to assess the site said in his report that the disturbance pattern was consistent with the movement of a significant weight across the ground. Consistent with, but not proof of. The families were told. They sat with that information the way you sit with something that is simultaneously the most and least satisfying answer imaginable. It was not nothing. But it was not nearly enough. The detectives' reinvestigation produced one other development that had been overlooked in the original case. A man who had been employed seasonally at Whispering Pines Lodge in the summers of 1988 and 1989, working maintenance, groundskeeping, basic repairs, had a record. Not a violent record. But a record of deception, fraud, identity theft, the kind of low-level criminality that involves taking things that do not belong to you and constructing false versions of events to conceal it. He had not been employed at the lodge in September of 1990 when Thomas and Bobbie disappeared. But he had worked there. He knew the property. He knew the layout of the cabin and the path through the forest behind it. His name was not released publicly. When investigators tracked him down, he was living in a different state entirely, had been for several years. He agreed to speak with detectives voluntarily. He answered their questions. He provided an alibi for the weekend of the disappearance, a family gathering several hours away, corroborated by multiple relatives. He was never charged. He was never named as a suspect. But his existence in this case, the fact of his connection to the lodge and his history of taking things from other people, added itself to the long, unsatisfying list of things this case could not fully resolve. The file was updated. The file stayed open. Years passed. Bobbie's mother died in 2003, having never learned what happened to her daughter. She kept the folder on her kitchen table until the end. Her younger daughter, Bobbie's sister, inherited the folder, the file copies, the letters to state senators, all of it. She has continued the advocacy work in the years since. She has spoken at missing persons events. She has given interviews when the case has occasionally resurfaced in true crime publications or documentary features. She refuses to let it go quiet. Thomas's father lived until 2011. His mother is still living at the time of this recording. She does not do interviews. She has, by most accounts, retreated inward in the way that some losses eventually demand. But she has never stopped knowing that her son is out there somewhere, in some form, in some state, and she has never accepted the alternative. The case has been reviewed 3 times since the 1996 reinvestigation. Each time, new technology has been applied, more sophisticated soil analysis, updated forensic databases, advances in DNA matching that have transformed cold case investigations nationwide. Each review has produced the same result, nothing definitive. No remains identified. No suspects charged. No confession extracted. No witness who has come forward with information that holds up under scrutiny. The Whispering Pines Lodge, the Honeymoon Cabin, as locals still sometimes call it, was eventually sold. The property changed hands twice in the years since and underwent a significant renovation. The original cabin where Thomas and Bobbie stayed no longer looks quite as it did in 1990. The fireplace is different. The windows have been replaced. The porch has been rebuilt. But the forest behind it is unchanged. The same pine trees press in from the same directions. The same mountain air moves through the same gaps in the canopy. And somewhere in that northeast section of the woods, in the area where the dogs circled and the soil told a story no one could fully read, the question remains. What happened in those mountains? There are theories, of course. There are always theories in cases like this. There is the theory of voluntary disappearance, that Thomas and Bobbie, for reasons no one on the outside ever understood, chose to walk away from their lives. That they had planned it, or decided it in the moment, and that somewhere they are living under different names, older now, the way everyone gets older. This theory requires you to believe that two people could abandon their families without a single word, through decades of searching, without a single credible sighting. Most people who have spent serious time with this case find that theory increasingly hard to sustain. There is the theory of an accident, that the couple went into the forest on that first night or the following morning, that something happened to them out there, a fall, an injury, a medical event, and that the mountain simply swallowed what was left. This theory is more plausible, but it does not fully account for the absence of remains in over 30 years of periodic searching, or for the wallet turning up in Alabama, or for the earlier credit card use. And there is the theory that something far darker happened in or near that cabin. That someone knew they were there. That someone came for them deliberately, for reasons that remain unspecified by any evidence in the file. That the disturbed soil in the forest northeast of the lodge is not a coincidence and not an animal. That the former maintenance worker's alibi, corroborated only by family members, deserves a harder look than it ever received. That Thomas Clark and Bobbie Taylor did not disappear. That they were taken. None of these theories has been proven. None has been disproven. They exist simultaneously, like light passing through the same prism, splitting into possibilities that cannot all be true at once but cannot individually be ruled out. That is the particular torture of a case like this one. It does not end. It does not conclude. It keeps producing new angles of grief, new moments of almost, new questions that attach themselves to the ones that came before and drag everything deeper. And yet the families stay. Bobbie's sister stays. She keeps the folder. She keeps making calls. She keeps saying their names in rooms where someone might hear and remember and connect a dot that no one has connected yet. Because in cases where there is no body and no ending, the act of continuing to speak someone's name is the only form of presence left. It is the refusal to let the question close itself with a wrong answer. It is the insistence that a life, a complete, full, joyful life that was only just beginning, deserves more than a fading ribbon on a tree in the Tennessee woods. Thomas Clark and Bobbie Taylor went to the Smoky Mountains on their honeymoon in September of 1990. They have not been found. The case is open. And somewhere in those mountains, where the pines grow thick enough to swallow a sound, where a red ribbon can vanish in a single winter, that question still has no answer. Until then, we keep asking. We keep saying their names. Thomas. Bobbie. Wherever you are, you have not been forgotten. Candle, if this story moved you, if you believe Thomas Clark and Bobbie Taylor deserve justice, then do 3 things right now. Hit the like button so this video reaches more people. Subscribe to Cold Case YTJ so you never miss a case. And share this video to your story or send it to someone who needs to hear it. Cold cases go cold because people stop talking about them. You can change that. Drop a comment below with the words, say their names, and let's make sure Thomas and Bobbie are never forgotten. Thank you for watching. I will see you on the next case.